If you work in quality control at a candy factory, you know strict safety regulations come with the job. It's why you partner with Grainger. Grainger helps you find the high-quality and compliant products your business needs to inspect, detect, and help correct issues. And the sweetest part is, everyone gets a product that's as safe to eat as it is delicious. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Hello listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini-series with Anke Richter, author of the incredible book Cult Trip. To find out more about Anke, you can follow the links in the episode description. But for now, here is Anke. The parts of Cult Trip that really resonated with me personally as a reader were the parts where you spoke within these experiences and gathering these testimonies and how it was affecting you personally, collecting all of this information. And a part of your book, a part of Cult Trip that I read, says, "My reaction to Louise's pain is another sign that I've come too close. My research feels like it's turning into a moral crusade. I'm on a slippery slope, and not just professionally. Instead of talking to Louise, I should be seeing a therapist." And that was like a ton of bricks on me when I read that. It is so tough to stay neutral and objective and not get angry and frustrated on behalf of the individuals that we speak to about these experiences. And I wonder now, if that is the reason you had to stop writing the book, how do you come to that decision? It must be extremely difficult to put in hundreds of hours of work to have people tell you their deepest, most harrowing experiences, and then also have to say, well, I'm sorry, I need to do this for myself, but I also now can't help you tell your story the way you wanted it to be told. There's, again, so many layers and levels, and I wondered if you could just talk us through how you navigate that.
Look, there was a bit more of a backstory than what I wanted to put in the book, because the most, I didn't want to take away from the story of the victims and survivors. Their pain surmounts, the pain I felt having to talk to them about it. Yeah, and you're right. It is vicarious trauma, but at the same time, I wanted to give their trauma and what I can tell through that more space. But I can tell you a bit more now. Okay, so what happened was sheer overwhelm, and that I didn't have a person who was guiding me. I didn't have a boss. At my news outlets, you have an editor, you have an editor-in-chief, or you have a newsroom, you have colleagues. If you write for a publisher, a book, you have your editor in the publishing house. I didn't have that because that person had left 4 months into it all. And when the project became more and more complicated, and I thought, okay, I really need to speak to someone from Allen & Unwin, especially maybe the legal department or so, just to get some guidance, because there's so many conflicting things, and I just don't know how to really, make sure that I can put all this in the book, and don't have to take half of it out later, and just to get some guidance here. I was out of my league, felt out of my depth. They pretty much fobbed me off and told me, because they all went back to Sydney then. The person who signed me up was from New Zealand. Anyway, long backstory. They weren't very supportive. I think they were getting cold feet actually at this stage, because they were getting legal threats as well from some other people who weren't happy with what I was doing. So they probably thought, oh, this book is going to cost us a lot in legal fees. And they just wanted me to finish it and not make a fuss and, not make it complicated. But it was complicated. It wasn't as straightforward and easy as that. And so I was already dealing with all these conflicts and contradictions and the legal issues. and had no one really to go to apart from one amazing freelance investigative journalist here in New Zealand who became my mentor, and I could run a few things past him, but he could not relieve me of that emotional burden. And you've just, I think you've described it really well, this feeling. I didn't even really realize at the time what it was, because I had no training in that. I've been a journalist. I was a journalist already at that stage for over 20 years, and I've done all sorts of interesting, fascinating stories and interviews with celebrities and investigative, big stuff. But I'd never come that close to trauma victims, especially not around sexual abuse. And I had no training of any sorts about that and what it actually means and what it can do to you with, and that I had no supervision, like maybe a policewoman has when she interviews someone for the first time, or how therapists have it. So in some ways I was in a similar role, hearing people like Louise, the girl in the caravan. I was the first person she ever told her horrific story to in her mid-40s. She'd never even spoken to a therapist, even though she'd taken people to court, but she'd only written it all down for the court. So, I took on a lot that I just didn't know what to do with it. And then a dear friend of mine died here in Christchurch in a car crash with her little girl and another kid in the car. So it was a massive trauma that I went through, or grief. I was just floored by grief. Stopped to my tracks, stopped my whole research for about 2 months or so. And it was almost a relief at the time that I could just stop everything. So, it sounds awful, but I do remember really well the day when she died, and I was actually just off to another round of interviews in Auckland, and this call came in the morning. Her friend had died, and amongst this immense pain and shock and the horror of it all, sending an email out to these people I'd lined up for my next interviews, when it would be difficult and they might pull back, and they were all the difficult ones, the deniers and the enablers, and one woman who'd gone to jail, actually. Just sending an email, say, look, sorry, we can't do this interview, a friend of mine's died, I will come back to you at some stage. It was such a relief, actually. That should have told me something, right? And then a few months later, when I was ready to pick things up again, I was almost a bit cynical at that stage when someone, said trauma. And I thought, you guys don't even know what real trauma is. My friend, the husband of the dead, friend, he survived the car crash and half of his family is gone. And so anyway, this is just a bit of a backstory that's not in the book, but this is also what I was going through. I was just finding it all way, way, way too hard. And then because of the delay of the grief and just the pure accumulation of material and court cases and contradictions, I asked my publisher to push the deadline out for another half year, because my deadline was coming up. And they said, no, sorry, we can't, which I think was just to get an out clause for them, actually, because they probably got cold feet at this stage. So I paused everything. I stopped everything. And I thought it was just going to be a pause. I actually went on a silent meditation retreat for a week to just, come to an answer. And then when I came out of that at the end of that year, I was always, okay, I've just hit the pause button. We'll see what I'll do with it. And the longer the pause lasted, the longer it was clear I can't go back to it. It's been so detrimental to my own mental health. And like you said before, Casey, I felt like I was really letting some people down, especially Louise. They've given, I spent so much time with them. They had such high hopes, her and Angie, but especially Louise had such high hopes with this book. What a change it would bring, that people would actually hear their stories, that it would help to stop sexual abuse of children and communities and so on. And then I could only write the making of it was still a long form journalism, it was still a long form feature here for a really prestigious magazine. It was actually nominated for a media award later, but to me, it really felt like a massive failure, that I'd set out to do this big work and I failed and I couldn't do it, and I couldn't do these people justice who trusted me and given me so much of their, innermost personal experiences. It was really big. And looking back, I think, wow, that was that. The making of the book that was never written in the end. But then there was a second round a few years later, and this is why we read Patrick, because at least some of that manuscript that I had back then actually then made it into the new book, and maybe all for the better. Who knows? Yeah.
The other part of the center point section of Cult Trip that really spoke to me as an individual was the almost the cognitive dissonance that you experienced around interviewing individuals that were apologists or deniers or defenders of Centrepoint, complicit in the child abuse, in the sexual abuse of children and young adults, the most vulnerable of individuals that found their way to Centrepoint or were placed there because their parents joined. It's almost like you allow us to see the cogs turning in your mind when you're like, okay, let's think about the times, let's think about let's think about the way things were back then. And then it's like, okay, all right, but that's not a good enough reason for these things to have happened. There's no reason why these things should have ever happened. And then there's the other side of you that's like thinking about the isolation and the coercion and how some people were asking to participate in sexual intercourse with adults. But then again, you go back to, but that's still not ever going to be an answer that's acceptable. How are you now, after these years and years of specifically researching cults and doing work in this space? How are you now with balancing this particular conundrum?
You mean the conundrum of how it can rub off on you and mess with your head, or the conundrum of trying to see it from all sides, which is part of the other conundrum, right? Yes, I think this is actually, looking back, I think this is why it was so conflicting for me, because the other cults that I researched, especially the last one, Gloriavel, this fundamentalist Christian cult in New Zealand, I was never torn really between, I can see it from, both sides. It was just more black and white for me. I just could not get on board at all with the whole community, with who they are. I just basically saw everyone in there as a victim, and I still do, yeah. And I just can't identify with the leaders or anyone, wanting to be in there. With Centrepoint, it was so conflicting because, like what I said in the beginning, maybe because I was drifting into a bit of a, sexual liberal self-exploration scene myself, and also because they were Centrepoint. It wasn't just Centrepoint at the time, even parts of the German Greens and the alternative movement of the 80s, they had some of these similar sort of liberal sounding, but actually very warped ideas that are very, very outdated, and about sexually free children. And they showed me it's some of the Centrepoint deniers who were apologists, enablers, who were, therapists there, and still have the narrative that it's actually society that's that's the baddie and they were the goodies, if only people would have let them be. They came up with, they showed me studies and whatnot of tribes in the South Pacific or Melanesia where boys are sexually initiated by their uncles, and only, and they were totally fine. It's only when anthropologists come, all these things were in this field. I was constantly, it's almost like I sometimes actually had to question myself, am I getting something wrong here? Am I too conditioned to think in one way? And this is my paradigm that I grew up in, and where, this is right and this is wrong. I had to question that sometimes. And it was really, really disturbing. Because almost like when you spend too much time with these people, it's almost like, you start questioning yourself. Maybe I got it all wrong. Maybe I am on a, moral crusade here that's not really doing them justice, and I'm just getting one end of the stick. And I remember at that time also speaking to quite a well-known Jeffrey Mason, quite a well-known writer who, anyway, from the States. He was very interested in what I was doing, my work, because he's also a psychotherapist and so on. And I remember once going to him as a bit of a mentor and talking things through with him, because he knew the whole scene from Esalen in California and the human potential movement. And I remember going to him and saying, it's not really, it's just not black and white. There's just a massive gray zone. And he said, no, I don't see a gray zone. I see a massive black spider with some little white dots in between. And I never forgot that he said that. Yeah, it's always stuck with me that there is just so much darkness, and it's so, depending on where you stand, there's so much so off-putting. But then again, I want to have this compassion, and I still do. I want to have the compassion, at least the understanding for why people did what they did. And I always had to ask myself, who would I have been in there? Yeah, would I have been the whistleblower? Would I have been the bystander? Would I have been the mother who tries to protect her children from the worst in there, but doesn't have the means or the guts to actually pack up and leave because, 10 years earlier, I told everyone this is the thing I need to do, and this is the best place, and how. So you kind of have to stick with your own narrative, otherwise, the cognitive dissonance. So I could always empathize with all these different aspects. So to answer your question, how did I manage to be okay now, which I am, is because when another publisher, after all these years, I had totally borrowed the Centerpoint book. Two documentaries actually came out of my magazine story and a project, and so it wasn't all wasted. But eventually, I kept on doing other cult stories, and eventually HarperCollins asked me if I wanted to write a book about cults, and I already had a lot of material and updated it and pulled it all together. And at that stage, I already knew I need better. I can only do this again if I have really good support, if I go and see a therapist, if I have a team, basically, of friends and colleagues. I had my little chat group on WhatsApp. I actually didn't need them as much as I thought, but they were there. So I made sure I had the right support. I would take enough breaks. And also the worst, the most traumatic, the worst interviewing, the most horrific content, that was all basically already investigated and done. I just had to pull it up again and go over it again now with Anke and Louise and others. And luckily they were willing to do that and gave me a second chance after, I let them down once. So it was actually psychologically, emotionally not as taxing, nowhere near as difficult as it was the first time when I just fell into, didn't know, what I was getting myself into, and then ended up with vicarious trauma and an overwhelm. This time I was more prepared and more professional, and I was more distant. I basically did what you do as a journalist, and you keep a bit of distance, and yeah, so far so good. I made it.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about, by the time you arrive at Gloria Vale, you're kind of like, okay, I see it this way, and that's the way I see it. And I think that shows tremendous growth and experience that you've had over the number of years that you've spent within these environments. It's strange to think about Centerpoint and individuals that perhaps showed up to experience intentional communities and were then subjected to Bert Potter's skewed ideas of how we should be sexually liberal and what that entails from his disgusting perspectives. And the way that I speak about Bert Potter, I think, tells everybody how I can't really be objective. and then also how Bert Potter almost was trying to find anything he could academically that would justify the perversions that he had and that he inflicted on other people. And that included things like, as you mentioned, he visited himself the Esalen Institute in California. And then there was Larry Constantine's book that you mentioned in Cult Trip, titled Children and Sex, New Findings, New Perspectives in 1981, which was hugely used across Centerpoint to justify how having sex with children is good for them. And it's just the weirdest, most backwards research. And nobody really knows what the outcome of those practices are until decades later, when the victims of those practices are coming forward to say, this is how we've been affected horrifically. Like, we have come to points in our lives where we don't want to be alive anymore. Much like we've had the findings of how it affects children when they're physically beaten as punishment, and that's why we're not allowed to do that anymore. Parents aren't allowed to harm their children as a form of punishment.
I mean, they were basically lab rats in a human experiment in some ways, right? They were used in a human experiment with horrific outcomes. And you know this also from other groups. So the rate of suicide, of prostitution, of drug abuse, of mental health problems years later, whether it's from the sannyasin communities or Children of God or Centerpoint, especially those types of communities where so-called sexual freedom was forced on the kids. A lot of them turned asexual. I met a few of them, not surprisingly, boys as well. So, and also let's not forget, boys were also sexually abused at Centerpoint. That's still a bit of an untold story, by the way. The predatory women, and also I met someone who's not in my book. Maybe one day I can write a story about him, but he had a massive breakdown just before the pandemic, not that long ago, and went off the rails with drugs and sex addiction. And until then, he had held on to the narrative that his mum, one of the leading therapists there who'd been in jail, that she, that everything was fine. Whereas in fact, he had been sexually abused by another woman there, and the mother wasn't in. I mean, it's so complex. Those stories decades later still affect people. And yeah, I can't stress enough how big the carnage is, especially for those who didn't choose to go there. It's adults were damaged there too, as they are in every cult. But at least you could say they had at least a choice before. The children didn't. They had a. Yeah, I mean, I could.
It was interesting to mention the Esalen Institute where Bert Potter went to stay. I always say that place, I know that there may be some great things that have come out of there, but the Esalen Institute has a lot to answer for.
I went there last year. I was there last year.
Did you go? How did you find it?
I did. And I actually wrote, exactly with my cult glasses on, I actually wrote a big story for North and South magazine here in New Zealand, the one where I also published my first Centerpoint story. How did I find it? Well, this is so complex. I actually really liked it. And I'm also really aware of their history. I mean, so are they, to be fair. Yeah. I think they've come a long way to make sure, to change. So my cult alarm bells were actually not ringing when I was there. And if you look at their history, they have a lot to answer for. They were the birthplace of not just Bert Potter, but a few other cult leaders, like Werner Erhard and others. And the misogyny and the sexual abuse there, and the people who died, who went into psychosis or jumped off the cliffs or killed themselves because they were psychonauts and took too many psychedelics. I mean, they were explorers and pioneers, and they came with a death toll, right? So definitely a very fascinating, interesting history. But my sense was, and I didn't do a deep dive sort of investigation, I just looked at the history, and then I had my own experience there for a week. And my overall sense was that they're on a good track, and they're doing good things, and they're aware, and they're trying to be more diverse, and they're sort of doing the work to not be a culty place. But I know it's a bit of a touchy subject to go there as a cult journalist. I was certainly, don't know if they were so happy to have someone there who had those glasses on. Yeah.
Your summary is so interesting when you think about how Charles Manson went there one time and they kicked him out because they couldn't get on board with any of his ideas. And then you think but you have all of these really wild out there ideas yourself. And yet Charles Manson shows up and they say, no, you can't stay here. I mean, so I'm sure they made it onto his vendetta list along with many other people who were like, oh, no, I don't know about you, Mr. Manson.
I mean, Esalen is fascinating because if it's a cult, then it's the Gestalt cult. Yeah, that's what it was known for, because the Gestalt was the dominating mythology, not mythology, but the yeah, that's sort of their thing, and again, that's all a bit changed, and it's not so dominant anymore. But it was very much, always a place where everything is under the umbrella of Gestalt. And again, it has its pros and cons. And Gestalt in its early days was far more radical and extreme than what we see now. What absolutely, respected therapists work with. It's not in itself a dangerous modality, but the way it was, how it all played out in the beginning in those encounter groups. I mean, Esalen is fascinating, and it is the birthplace of the human potential movement. And then Centrepoint was the New Zealand, or the Antipodean appendix of the human potential movement. It was the only place, I think, this part of the world, and it was a heavily inflamed appendix that was ready to burst at some stage. And don't think it's because of the human potential movement as such, or because of Gestalt therapy, or maybe not even because of its promiscuity, or and I just take the sex for children out of that now, but just not even the sexual liberation itself, I think, was the problem, or doesn't need to be the problem. It was the fact that they had a charismatic, narcissistic leader who dominated everything, and he called himself God. So there was the problem right from the start. Yeah.
Another place that Bert Potter went to observe, learn some things, take them back to Centrepoint, which kind of ties us really nicely into the next part of Cult Trip, is the ashram of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in India. So I'm just going to ask you if you can talk the listeners through that whole experience. We saw Frank, your husband, before we hit record, and he makes a few appearances in Cult Trip. So I'm sure that Frank has some of his own stories on things that he's observed and experienced. But please talk us through everything that you have come to learn about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and the Rajneesh movement.
Right. So I grew up in Cologne in Germany, and that was the European headquarters at the time. And I was in my late teens, early 20s. I actually often went and danced in the Bhagwan disco. In Germany they all called him Bhagwan. Now everyone calls him Osho because he rebranded himself after his big scandal in the States. And I think the rest of the English-speaking world knows him more as Rajneesh. Yeah, it depends. So I was always familiar with the orange people in my neighborhood, in my city, and kind of fascinated and also repulsed. And I was always familiar with, what they stood for, what had gone down in Rajneeshpuram. So it wasn't only through Wild Wild Country that I learned about Osho's Emporium. That was old news for me. And I always kept a healthy distance from it all because of the things that we know. And I'm a journalist, and I always saw them as very critical. For me, they were absolutely a cult. And I think it was only here in New Zealand when I drifted into the neo-tantra scene, at least, put my toes in and met more and more people who I really liked, or they offered fascinating workshops, and then I heard their names and I saw that, they had that connection. And I often had to bring that up then and just question them a little bit, and then I stopped questioning it. I just accepted that some people thought he was great, and they didn't have my upbringing in Germany. They didn't, I almost envied them. They could just be more accepting and maybe naive and just take the good, whatever this guy had to offer, where I had always had my critical lens on it towards, when it came to the whole Rajneesh movement. And then my husband and I, we celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, and wanted to go on a big trip, like a second honeymoon, and went to India. And this idea came up to actually check out his ashram, because we knew that he's dead, he died, but that whatever's left of his cults actually split up in factions as well. As good cults do, they split up in factions when things fall over, right? So one faction still runs the Osho International Meditation Resort. Was it retreat? I think it's resort, yeah. OIMR. And you can check yourself in there. You can book yourself in there and do a week of meditation, or they offer all sorts of programs and primal this and tantra that. Actually, they don't do a lot of tantra anymore. Mystic Rose and all these things. So we thought, okay, before we start our backpacking or traveling around India, let's just have a week there and check this out as cult voyeurs some ways, but also knowing the guru is dead, the scandal's been and gone. we didn't feel like we were actually supporting an abusive system at that stage. But we also went there with a kind of skepticism, but also like a sense of adventure. So we checked. We had a week there. We slept in separate rooms. It's almost like a monastery, all very zen, very cold, lots of marble. We had to, on the first day, oh my God.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Basically, I got so rebellious there in no time, because on the first day they put you through all these hours and hours of watching videos and all the rules and all the hygienists and the money that, I mean, you have to spend so much money there. You have to buy all these gowns in maroon, and then for the night meditation in the big sort of UFO like massive cut like temple, you have to have a white gown, and if you actually get pulled out of the meditation room there, and they tell you off if you break the rules in any way, you sneeze or so. So it was ridiculous on one level, and it was fascinating on another level. And it is the case with those kind of places. You get used to it after a while. You don't. I was very rebellious in the beginning and thought, oh God, what am I doing here? This is ridiculous. And then I was also curious and fascinated, and I sort of went with the flow and did more and more of their courses and their sessions that they offered, and then the massage and the dancing and whatnot. But I was also actually really relieved to leave there. And I ran into one of the head honchos, and also the infamous former doctor of Osho was also there. He was walking around and saw him. He's quite famous. And I did an interview also with one of the heads there. And first thing he tells me is, we're the anti-card. And I thought, wow, since then I've heard this too many times. So it's like an instant red flag for me when you say, oh, this feels a bit culty, and they say, no, we're the anti-card. Okay, great. That was not the good answer to show me that you understand anything about cults. So it was a fascinating experience, and I would not really want to go back. But people flock there, lots of Westerners, also nostalgic people from who miss the good old times, and now it's all very zen and very polished and very business-like, and they make, I don't know what it's like now post-pandemic, but pre-pandemic they were making big bucks, and they had lots of volunteers working for them as usual, because then they can still have their experience of being there. Lots of Indians as well who pay less, and then they have special rules. They can't participate in some of the more sexual courses or so. So it's a bit of they've been accused of racism, the OIMR. So it was all fascinating. It was like a little cultiverse there in Pune. And then on one day we just had enough, and we just got on a motorbike and we drove to a tattoo festival somewhere in the outside of town, and we felt like escapees. It was amazing. There was rock music, and it just felt real and alive, and not so sterile and so weird and so conformist. And so that also to have the contrast of a loud, noisy Indian city, and then you're in this serene environment, which in itself it can be wonderful, a serene environment, but not when it feels so controlling, and the whole history also of what it stands for. And no one there was happy to talk about that. They told me, no one wants to talk about that, what went down, all these years ago. Only you with your dirty mind. That's what they literally told me.
That was the really interesting interaction between you and the head honcho, where you would press him and ask those difficult questions, but these things did happen. Oh, you're a journalist, so only you think that. And I'm like, how do you know that she's the only one that thinks that? Like, and then he would say, you need to move on, everyone else has. And again, it was that thought terminating cliche language that he was using, like if you have a problem with this, it's only you that has a problem with it. Nobody else does. Everybody else understands that that's all in the past. Very similar language to the apologists of Centrepoint, to those that were complicit in what happened there. And I just thought it was really interesting, because then you said, well, how come the only books you can buy from the bookshop are those written by Osho? And yeah, you were asking all the wrong questions. Just, it was really, really interesting part of the book, because he does have defenders around the world. And I always say that people need to stop quoting Osho, because he was never an enlightened being that had a closer connection to divinity than anybody else.
And we now know that he was a sexual abuser. As of last year, a woman has come forward. I mean, all power to her. She finally spoke up, and it's on the record. I mean, we've heard it from one of his victims. So he was a serious sexual abuser, yeah, and he had a hit list. I mean, that again has changed. I mean, not that there was much to change, because I already, didn't think highly of him and never got the fascination. But that in itself is just a really big piece that I think they need to acknowledge. Until then, they're sexual abuse enablers and deniers and apologists. Oh, and the last little fun fact from my stay at the resort was that I got very sick from Sufi whirling and collapsed in the grass. Too much Sufi whirling, it's not good for the stomach, I can tell you. Yeah.
I think that is that the part where Frank says he's had a great time, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing very well.
He was enjoying himself a lot more. Maybe he was just more open-minded, whereas I was always critical. It's like, why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? That's ridiculous. Oh, and I always tried to swim in the pool, but you had to pay extra to swim in the pool, and it became a little challenge every day that I could just sneak off, go into the pool. And once they called me, I get out of here straight away. And I thought they would actually frog march me to the changing rooms. It's that kind of environment. No, it didn't feel like a former sex cult. There was nothing sexy about it, nothing cozy and cuddly and sensual. It was all very, militaristic in some ways. Almost. I mean, at least for me. I've got to be careful here. Don't want them to sue me. I'm sure they're pretty litigious and they might be listening. So for me, it felt like that. I'm not saying this is what it is, okay? You're right.
And ironically, the conformity and the militaristic aspect of what now happens in the ashram compared to what used to happen in the other ashram is quite a contrast. And I imagine outwardly, Rajneesh always said, this is not how we live, even though, of course, intrinsically attempting to also establish a system of totalist authoritarianism, whilst preaching that that's not what we do here.
I mean, there are a lot of people who are not happy, even here around me in Christchurch, who still adore Osho, and they were not happy because they think I'm making a mockery out of it all. And yeah, I mean, to be fair, I only went there for a week, and I only went to what is now this resort, which some of the old guard who are not happy with what's happening in that, Cashram or Club Med now, they can always, and they do say to me, well, you weren't there in the old days. This is all different. We were all, we're having the best time of our lives, and we were listening to Osho, and it was so amazing. It was this big communal experience and the group awakening. And of course, you wouldn't find that if you just go there for a week now and this on a spiritual holiday, with a lot of cynicism, and your journalistic mind on. And that again is such a cop out, because yes, of course, what I experienced that week doesn't prove anything, but the knowledge is there. I mean, we know what happened, and there are enough people now speaking up about it. And just because I'm shining a little light on my week there, and what you rightly, you're absolutely right. One of the people there being such a cult apologist is actually very, very telling for the whole organization, I think. But it's really hard. It was always hard for me throughout the whole book, with people who are opposed to what I do, that they could always say, you haven't been there, but you weren't there. You weren't one of us. You haven't come out of the cult. Yeah, they can't really shut the survivors down, because they cannot go to someone like Louise, the girl in the caravan, and say this didn't happen to you. They can just pretend they didn't know, or maybe it wasn't that bad, or there's another side to the story or so. But with me, they can always say, you weren't there. You don't know. What do you know, right? So I'm always up against that, but I own that. I have spoken to enough people, and there's enough information out there, and it's also accessible to the deniers. They could have the same level of knowledge I've gained.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series with Anke Richter about her book Cult Trip. To find out more about Anke, you can follow the links in the episode description, and to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com, or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to chumbacasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at chumbacasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.